Hi, I'm Steve Green. Welcome to another video. Today what we're going to be looking at is debugging of plugins, sort of a couple of a few techniques really, using the tracing service, attaching to the W3WP service or sandbox worker process if it's registered in isolation, and then at the end I'll show you how to use the Debug Profiler, the plugin profiler, for when firewall restrictions prevent you attaching to the remote debugger, or for online environments where you don't have the option of attaching to a process. So what we're going to look at is based around an earlier piece of work we did with this custom swimming times entity. So if I go to the contacts, I'll show you the particular fields where we did some Java. So if I open this A Babington, double click it. So a bit not responsive for a second. So what we did previously in another video for JavaScript indirectly triggering plugins, there was some JavaScript that when you changed this field, updated the equivalent. There's a number of seconds field on this associated entity, this swimming time entity. So if I open that, we can see it updates the equivalent field. Obviously I've been messing around since, so it's not presently. So if I tab out, we should get our, which is from a previous plugin, so we got a successful message. The JavaScript REST has merged in the changes, and if we look here, we've got the equivalent number of seconds, and we had a plugin that calculated the number of minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break that. So if I go over to Visual Studio, click on my demo solution, wait for that to load. Yeah, I'm going to deliberately break the logic so that it should throw an exception. Okay, so this was the calculate minutes plugin that we registered against that swimming time entity. So it's fairly, well, it's a very simple plugin, standard context tracing service, reference late bound entity type, just do some basic checks on the message type and the entity, and then this was our logic where we took the late bound entity class and we cast it to our early bound swimming time entity. We did a basic check to see if the value wasn't null before doing a calculation, which is the one you saw where it divided by 60 to get the number of minutes. So what I'm going to do is break this logic, and probably the easiest way is to overload it. So if I surround that sum, and I'll just add on the maximum value that a decimal can store on top of what's already been calculated, so it should overload that decimal type there. So if I save that and deploy, right, so now that's deployed. So now what we've done, we've forced a value in excess of what a decimal can hold to be stored in number of minutes on this calculation. So if I go back to that record and I initiate the cause the on change event to fire, which will update swimming time again, cause the update plugin, which has now got some flawed logic. So there'll be a slight delay as it loads the plugin, and we can see that the JavaScript has failed, but it's not actually the JavaScript that's at fault, because the plugin is synchronous. It's thrown an exception which has caused the JavaScript merge to fail because it was unable to update the record. So obviously, if it is, you might be led to believe now that your JavaScript's at fault and you'd be diagnosing the JavaScript, but what we can do is, as we know the JavaScript interacts with this record, and we know we've got our plugin registered, we could go and test at the record level. So I could change it. Obviously it's not on and on change, this will require the save because it's an update. And then we can see our business process error. And if I click on download log file, we get prompted to download this error details. I mean, I can just open it for now, and we can see, yeah, I mean, that's an exception I'm outputting in my, if I look in the catch block, I'm outputting this exception EX message in the stack trace, which is what we can see there. So value is either too large or too small for a decimal, but we don't get any detail of where that was caused in the code, just that it was in the execute method, and there was a decimal addition that caused it. So if I close that, okay, the error at this point in this record is still unsaved because it threw an exception, so we'll just for now minimize that, go back to Visual Studio. So now the first thing I want to look at is using the tracing service that we instantiate at the start, which obviously sits outside the try catch block, so you can call it within the catch block as well, so it doesn't fall out of scope. If you instantiate it inside the try block, then when you jumped into a catch block you wouldn't have the tracing service available. So what you do with the tracing service, you just basically output messages. So here I could say tracing service.trace method, and then it expects a string, so I could just say about to instantiate entity, something like that. And then a bit lower down we could do, just before these checks, we could do another tracing service. Something like about to check input parameters for target, something like that, and so on and so forth. Obviously you could build them around where you believe there's error issues with the code, so obviously you could come down to here, and prior to this check we could say about to check if number of seconds is null or something like that. Just be aware though that you don't actually cause an exception by what you're outputting. So what I mean by that is where here we're doing a check for the number of seconds is not null before we try to do mathematical calculations with it, which would have thrown an exception. You don't go and put something like a tracing output to say number of seconds, and then take the attribute and try and do something with it like the value property, because if it happens that that is null, obviously your code that checks that's defensive coding to check that it's not null before we try and calculate with it, your calling of that value property, if it was null, would actually cause the exception. So it's just something to be aware of when you make sure. I mean, you could do that with inside after this check of not null. You could do an output to show what the number of seconds was in a diagnostic trace, and that will do for now. I'll redeploy. Yeah, I've deployed that. What I will just add is just to show you the sort of where we're saying all these were sort of prior to all the checks. I'll just pop one inside, so just to show you that we can say tracing.trace and just say something like number of seconds not null, so we know seconds not null, so we know that it did get inside that, it passed that check, and we've just got some more output to read from. I mean, in this case we could actually put the value, as I was talking about, that could cause the exception. So I'll just deploy again. Okay, so back to my record that previously didn't save. Now we've added these extra tracing statements. The logic's still flawed and will overload. But if I save again, it will trigger our plugin, business process error, download the log file. Again, I'll just open it. But we can now see, as well as the exception that was thrown in the catch block, the additional outputs are available, so we get more of an idea where it got to in our code. So that's sort of the basics of the tracing service. But what would be far easier if we could actually see which line was causing it. I mean, obviously because it's such a short piece of code, we obviously saw it get to this number of seconds, not null, and it output the number of seconds. So we've got a pretty good idea where the issue lies, but far easier if we could actually step through the code and see it in action. So we do that by, we have to install the remote debugger on your CRM server, which is a free download, obviously, from Microsoft. Just minimize these. So if you do a search for Visual Studio 2012, if you're using Visual Studio 2012, if not, if you're using Visual Studio 2010, there's a remote debugger for that as well. I'm using Visual Studio 2012. So once this browser starts up, if we go into Google, a little bit slow. So if I do a search for Visual Studio, even Studio would be good, 2012 remote debugger. I don't think it is called the remote debugger anymore, but obviously if you do a search for it, it'll point you to the right update you need for Visual Studio. Remote debugger. Yeah, it's this, here you go, it's this download remote tools for Visual Studio 2012 Update 4. You download that and install it, and that puts the remote debugger on as a service. I think you can run it either on demand, and you start it from the, I think it's the Visual, yeah, so you've got this remote debugger as an application where you start it and run it, and then you stop it again, or it can be run as a service. So through the configuration wizard, you can opt to run as a service, and it should be permanently running then and start up with the system. Obviously it depends on your environment whether you want it constantly running. I think it's might just be called yeah, I think it's just called remote debugger. Yeah, so there you go. There's the remote debugger. Okay, so what we need to do is, I'll just minimize that, from within our Visual Studio, so we can say put a breakpoint if we start it right at the start up here where we basically instantiate the entity, well, define an entity reference type and initialize it as null. You go to the debug tab and there's this attach to process, but the process you need to attach to will depend upon how you've got your plugin registered. And what I mean by that is if I expand CRM package and open the register file, right at the start of our plugin solution, so before all our different plugins, class libraries that make up this solution, we've got this isolation mode. Obviously if you sandbox it, it'll be the sandbox worker process that you'd need to attach to, and if that was said none or none, that would be the w3wp.exe process, which is the IIS worker process. Obviously custom workflow assemblies, it depends again, if they're sandbox it'd be the same sandbox worker process, and if they've registered full trust, so that said none, that it'd be the CRM async service. So I can show you now, if I attach the process, it defaults to your local machine, and then you can, if it's on the local network, I think you can just click find and it'll discover any remote debuggers on your local subnet. But I'll have to type mine in because I'm down a VPN tunnel, and I'll hit return. I think it defaults to port 4016. So there's a slight delay on mine down at VPN. So it's discovered the remote debugger, and now it's listed all of the services that are installed, and it's important to tick the show processes from all users. So if I scroll down, I can show you these are the two asynchronous services. One is the maintenance service, one is the standard async service, but when debugging, because you wouldn't necessarily know which process ID without stopping the maintenance service, just attach to both, just highlight both and click attach, but obviously this isn't a workflow. So then down in the process list you can see there's this host service, which is not the one we attach to, and there's 2 worker processes. Those do actually increase at times under heavy load if there's a lot of plugins and custom workflows that are registered sandbox. So I've seen that go as high as 5 or 6 in the past, but you need to attach to all worker processes because you can't determine which one your assembly is going to be instantiated in and run. So attach to whatever worker process is there, and even when you're waiting to trigger it, you could possibly attach again and check. So I can attach to those 2. Prompts me because it's running under a different domain account about a potential security issue, but I'm happy. Then now that's attached to those 2 worker processes, I can also do attach to process again, scroll down again, and you can see the greyed out ones are the ones I'm presently attached to. If another thread had started, another worker process had started, you'd obviously want to attach to that as well, just in case your particular plugin did run in that process. So that's now attached. Obviously you can see it hasn't loaded the debug symbols yet, so we need to trigger the plugin. So again, I can just hit save. If it does this, if it ever does this where it doesn't break into your breakpoint, and if you check and there's not an additional worker process that has been created, which there hasn't, what you need to do is stop your Visual Studio, detach it, rebuild the whole solution, so it rebuilds all the debug symbols, all of the DLLs get recompiled and redeploy. I get this not frequently, but when you do and you can't work out why it won't break in, just redeploy. Let's try that again then. So up to debug, attach to process, wait for the list of processes, go down to my sandbox worker processes, highlight both, attach, obviously acknowledge my warning due to the different service account. Again, the debug symbols won't load until the plugin is actually cached for the first time because it's just been redeployed. So now hopefully if I save, we should see the debug symbols load shortly. I mean, mine's down a VPN, so there's a bit of a delay, but yours should be a lot quicker on premise. And I can tell the fact that the window, the Internet Explorer window, disappeared and it brought Visual Studio to the forefront. So you can see it's broken into that. Sorry about that, my F10 key is my stop key for the recording software, so I've just changed the hotkey. So now if I press F10, that's step over, so it would just keep stepping over each line of code. So it should now step down to the tracing service and step again, it goes down to the next check. You can see there's this horrible delay on mine down the VPN tunnel. If you're on premise, this should be virtually instant, depending on the spec of your server. But you can keep stepping through, and obviously you can hover over, much like you do with any debugging of code, you can hover over properties and see what they actually equate to and so on. So if I let this run down to where we instantiate the early bound type, if I just click continue and it'll run to the next breakpoint. Be aware that obviously there's a 2-minute timeout for any plugin, so if this runs for more than 2 minutes, it will terminate the process and then we'll just get an obscure exception thrown. So we can see we're now approaching where I have overloaded the code. So if I just step over these next couple of lines, if I don't time out, we should see it jump into the catch block. So sorry about these delays, it's the issues when you're remote down a VPN tunnel. So now we should throw an exception because of this exceeding the value. So there you go. Now if I F10 once more, you should see the exception be instantiated and there'll be a message we can see, which is what got output here, this ex.message. So there you go, value is either too large or too small, but you can see how much easier that is to pinpoint the particular issue. I mean, you could obviously remove breakpoints. If I just continue that, remove breakpoints when you're satisfied certain areas of code are fine, put them in later in the process and trigger it again if there was a lot of lines of code. So now that should throw back a business process error to which yeah, I think it has. It may have actually timed out. Yeah, so that actually was because it timed out rather than the exception we should have got. So that was because of me having to restart the video recording, as well as it taking so long to step down through the code. It actually was just the sandbox process terminated it. But that's the concept of obviously the remote debugger. So we can see how the tracing can be useful, and obviously you can run that if you run a diagnostic trace. So there's a diagnostic tool you can download off the internet. You can enable it on your CRM server, turn on enable tracing, use the system, stop the trace, and there's a massive log file that it collates, very verbose log file that you can look through, and these tracing.service.trace outputs will also be present. Even if it doesn't throw exceptions, it still outputs these, so it is quite useful to see what was run on the platform and so on. The final bit I wanted to cover was the Debug Profiler, which not many of you may be aware of, which is part of the plugin registration tool. So if you go to your SDK where you've extracted it, so mine's on my C drive, in the bin folder you'll find this there you go, plugin registration tool that's pre-compiled, an executable. If you double click that, it loads this plugin registration tool. You can set up a connection to your discovery service or the discovery URL. You only need to put the leading part of you don't need to put the whole XRM services. It will do that automatically when it connects. So if you were on a domain, you could use save credentials and it would pass through your Windows credentials, but I'm not, so if I hit connect, it will connect, discover all the organisations that are present on that server, and then I can open my CRM demo solution. I mean, I'm hoping most of you are fairly familiar with the plugin registration tool. It's just another way of what we see in the CRM Explorer when we register plugins, and it gives us those options. It's the more manual way of deploying assemblies and registering steps, but where I showed on the previous one about doing a count on a many-to-many, it has all the message types available because of the way it orders them. So if I don't want to go too off topic, but if I show you this associate message we looked at the other day, it's the first thing it asks for is the message type and then the primary entity, so it supports more message types than the limitation of the developer toolkit for Visual Studio, but same kind of structure with the filtering attributes for updates. I mean, I can show you better on our calculate minutes step. So these are all the assemblies that are part of that CRM demo plugins assembly. So there's all these different plugins we've created. There's our calculate minutes. If I double click, this is the step. So that equates to within Visual Studio. If I open my calculate minutes and I edit the step, this dialog that loads now, so that the equivalent on the plugin registration tool is this. So again, filtering attributes, you can see it's selected just the number of seconds, so it's very familiar looking, the different stages of execution. So what we need to do, obviously solution wide, we need to, at the top, there's this install profiler which installs a managed solution onto your CRM. So I've clicked that will probably take a minute. So then we get this pop-up, profiler installed successfully, so I can OK that. So now you can see it's obviously got this plugin profiler at the bottom underneath the assemblies. Again, I can expand my assembly for the CRM demo plugins, choose my calculate minutes, and then choose my step. When I highlight the step, I get this extra profile option. So if I now click on that, it brings up a dialog. I'd leave it at the default, so this profile storage will be the exception, which will pass it back to the core. Well, I'll show you. Leave it on exception, and obviously include the secure configuration, which we haven't got on our plugin, but it just makes it more comprehensive, the output. So OK that. Again, there's a bit of a delay on mine, and now you can see in brackets it puts profiled. So I can now minimize that. You don't need to keep the plugin registration tool open, by the way. I'm just doing it so that we can go back to it in a minute once we've triggered the output again. So cancel, obviously we'll disregard what I was looking at there. Can minimize this, bring back up our record, and this could be another user with the profiling. A user could have told you about an issue. You could enable profiling, tell them to repeat what they were doing, and then when they trigger, so you phone them up and say, Bob, can you repeat the issue you were getting? He goes into the record again, saves, and then the exception message is slightly different this time. So it triggers the plugin, and then but it downloads a log file that he can then email to you. So now you get this download the details, unload with the plugin profiler and this gobbledygook text. So if I click download log file, this time I'll save it, and what I'd recommend is save it where your assembly is. So when you build a solution, so your project gets built, which mine will be obviously my code folder, CRM demo, and then it's the plugin solution. In the bin debug, I just want to save this. You can save it wherever you like, but I'll just show you why I'm doing that. So I'm actually drilling right down into where the assembly was compiled. When you deploy the solutions, Visual Studio builds it, creates a DLL and some debug symbols. So if I save it there, I can close that, disregard that message, minimize the window. Now I go back to my plugin registration tool. What I can do is click on the step again, and there's this debug option. If I click that, it brings up a dialog and asks me to load the log file. So the user's emailed you a log file where they've caused the exception to be thrown, but what you can see is that defaults to this debug folder. I mean, I possibly have browsed there earlier, but once you go to this folder, because the second part, so I pick the error details, open, so it's now, that's the path I was in, where the assembly is. Now it wants me to load the assembly. Well, obviously it's now in the same folder already, so it just makes it a quicker process, especially if you're trying to repeat this several times to analyze within Visual Studio, rather than having to go to your desktop or somewhere and then browse back through all these subfolders to find your assembly again. It just makes that so if we did this and then run it again, when I click that little folder browser, it'll default to that location, which just makes it easy to find both files. But anyway, I digress. So we've chosen the error log, we've picked the plugins DLL assembly. It then knows of all the plugins that are part of that assembly, and obviously it defaults to the correct one, which was the calculate minutes, but just make sure it is on the correct one. And then it tells you to attach Visual Studio to the plugin registration process and gives you the process ID. So when we go back here to debug and attach to process, where before we were looking at the server, which is obviously remembered, and the sandbox worker process, now we change this back to our local machine where we're running the plugin registration tool. So if I press P to go down to the P's, there we can see that 3956 ID plugin registration. So we attach to that. It's got our breakpoint. I think we've got one higher up as well, which I'll remove. And now when we go back to the plugin registration tool, so we've done that step, and now it tells us to start execution. When we click that, it will actually step into our code with the information that's contained in that log file. So we can actually look at the all the context and that was present at the time that occurred. So you can see within that swimming time instance there's a number of seconds, which is the 3200. So obviously for online customers where you can't attach to the process, this is a really useful way to capture what happened. And then yeah, it's obviously a lot faster because it's on my local machine. The plugin registration tool is actually hosting the process. So then we can F10 and we see throws the exception the same, and we can actually analyse what caused it and what was in the sort of message and what fields and properties and so on. So yeah, so I can now break out of that, and obviously you'll go back to the plugin registration tool and you can see it throws a similar assembly, and at the top we can see the same sort of message. There's one other element that I wanted to show you, and that's also how it will query records. So what I could do is instantiate my organization service context. Do a simple link query. From contacts in the contact set, just say where, well, won't do a where, we'll just do them order by first name or full name or something. That'll be ascending. Select contacts. I mean, what we'll do, we'll probably limit it. That's because that's a lot of contacts in the system. I'll just take the first 5. Okay, so yeah, that's a very simple link query. So if I deploy that modified version, so let's just rebuild. So that's rebuilt, deploy. Okay, so that's now deployed. If I go back to my plugin registration tool and just close this, it's still obviously being profiled. So now if I phone Bob back up and say, Bob, can you break the system again, please? So, well, that hasn't already saved, I'll just change it anyway. Hit save, loads the plugin, processes, throws the exception, tell him to download the log file again. So again, save as, pick the debug folder where our assembly is, overwrite that original file, so we can move that out of the way. Go back to our plugin registration tool, so obviously highlight the step, hit debug, go to our error details that Bob sent us, pick our assembly, our plugins DLL, obviously check it's defaulted to the right plugin, attach our Visual Studio, attach the process, again local machine, find our plugin registration exe and attach, and then we're ready to go back to the registration plugin registration tool, start execution. So it's stopped at our breakpoint. So now, if I F10, now it instantiates our extra bit of code, does our query, and we've now actually got real records that it returned. So you can see it's got people. If I scroll down to full name, they should be in alphabetical order. So yeah, Abid, so that's our first contact in the system. So, but it's important to note that it will only retrieve these records if you've connected the plugin registration tool. So let me just stop the debugging, go back to our plugin registration tool and close this debug area. Because I've double clicked and actually connected and downloaded the message types and the steps, I don't know quite how it does it, but it enables us to then retrieve records from the platform, but it obviously must be retrieving them live. But if I were to close this, reopen it, without then connecting and so on, I have got this replay plugin execution. So again, same process, click it, find our error details log that we just got sent, pick our assembly, CRM demo plugins, it's on the right plugin, attach our Visual Studio, so press P, pick my plugin registration executable, attach, same scenario, break in at this swimming time instantiation, hit execute, it'll jump back to Visual Studio, again we press F10, step through, same thing, instantiates the context, does our link query, but now if I expand we get this strange result, an event was requested after the recorded event queue has been completed. So it doesn't quite work in the same way. So if you then had code that actually iterated through these, it probably wouldn't work. I mean, somehow that plugin registration tool is able to handle the fact that this didn't return any results. It was still obviously for the sort of logic we're doing, it would throw the correct exception. But if this was processing through this some people, you might get some strange behaviour. So it's important to make sure your plugin registration tool is actually connected before you do the debug. But it does give you the option. I mean, if you're not doing retrievals of records, you're just processing the context that got sent in, it'll be fine. You don't have to attach. You can just leave it in that mode. Let me just detach. We leave it in that mode where you've literally just opened the plugin registration tool, not connected, and you can just replay a text file that someone sent you. So I hope that explains a little bit about debugging, and there's a few techniques both with with all three, the tracing service, obviously attaching to the W3WP or sandbox worker process. What I will quickly show you is if I change that to none and redeploy, sorry. Okay, so now that's redeployed, but instead of being in the sandbox, it's now deployed, so it'll just run the plugin within the W3WP process. So let me just load the registration tool and just clean up that profiling. So let me just connect. This is just how to remove the debug profile. So connect to my demo organization. Just maximize this. Just loading the messages and various elements, the assemblies and so on. Okay, so that's loaded. Now if I expand plugins again, calculate minutes, click on my step, I'll just turn off, I'll stop profiling on that step. So then it'll go back to a standard exception, so that's removed, and then I can uninstall the profiler solution. So this should disappear and remove it from the solutions for CRM. That should take a few seconds. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly show you how you register, or sorry, how you attach to the W3WP process instead of the sandbox worker process. It's still removing, so that's successfully removed, so I can close the registration tool, close that. So very identical principle, but if I attach the process, obviously it's on our local machine again at the moment because we moved it back to that to attach to the plugin registration tool. I can pick my development server, it'll list the processes, and then if we scroll right down towards the bottom we should see W3WP.exe, which is where full trust plugins will run. So it's only a single process, so it makes it a little bit easier to attach to. Again, attach, so same principle, cause this to trigger, and we should get Visual Studio jump to the front in a second. You can see it's flashing down there, loading debug symbols. Okay, that's finally loaded the symbols. So yeah, exactly the same, and then again we can F10 to step through. There's obviously different options where if you want to step into a method, so if it was calling a method and you didn't want to just step over and retrieve the result, you press F11, I think it is, and that actually jumps into that method, and you can step through again. But I think that completes what I wanted to show you. Any comments, queries or questions, feel free to post them below, and thanks for watching again. Bye.